Welcome, everyone. We're here for the third segment of our learning series for the New Frontier Forum, and we're pleased to have Douglas Brinkley with us. Doug has been a great champion of the library and really recently, both with JFK, A Vision for America, which was co-edited with Stephen Kennedy Smith, collects many of the great speeches of President Kennedy and puts it with contemporary voices and commentary on them. I think it's the best book you could buy to really jump into and think about the Kennedy legacy. So I encourage you to do that. And it was the greatest until American Moonshot came out to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the moon landing and to show just such a history of the American spirit of innovation, of challenge, of determination over years of time. It was really a terrific story to lift up what's really seen as some of the best in America. And as we look at that today, I think the work that Doug's going to be offering us on Rachel Carson and William Douglas and his long-standing work, if you've seen his books on the environment, on the American landscape, will really add so much to that. So thank you for being here, Doug. We will we'll let you do your presentation for 20 or so minutes, and then we'll turn back to questions. So thanks.
Well, it's great to get to talk about John F. Kennedy and the environment. My journey really began when I wrote a book called The Wilderness Warrior, Theodore Roosevelt and the Crusade for America. I did it with HarperCollins, and it was a real look at how TR saved 234 million acres of wild America as president. Theodore Roosevelt was born in 1858 in New York, and Charles Darwin's On the Origins of Species came out in 1859. And TR's father was one of the founders of the American Museum of Natural History. And so growing up with Huxley and Darwin, he was a taxidermist, Theodore Roosevelt, a bird watcher, and Theodore Roosevelt went to Harvard majoring in what today we would call wildlife biology, naturalist studies. He wrote his first book as an undergraduate called The Summer Birds of the Adirondacks. And on that book went with how TR created national monuments and saved the Grand Canyon and Muir Woods and Devil's Tower, and how he saved 51 federal bird reservations with executive orders, which became today's U.S. Fish and Wildlife. How national parks were saved by TR, like Crater Lake in Oregon or Mesa Verde in Colorado or Wind Cave in South Dakota, on and on. I mean, the teddy bear became Theodore Roosevelt's symbol over fair hunt conservation. So it was, as you all know, a big part of his legacy. And that book also dealt with John Muir and the early Sierra Club and this idea of saving wild America. I later did a book called The Rightful Heritage on Franklin D. Roosevelt and the saving of the land of America. And I looked in that book about how FDR, whenever he would put down occupation in his life, would put tree farmer down as what his job was. Franklin Roosevelt, during the Great Depression years, using the Civilian Conservation Corps and other work corps, they planted 3 billion trees, across the United States because of the wetlands have been drained. We have the Dust Bowl, soil erosion. The New Deal created all these soil conservation districts and the like. And so the two big presidents, when you're dealing in the realm of conservation and environmentalism, are the Roosevelts, and I wrote books about them both. But there was a third progressive revolution towards the environment or conservation, and that was started with John F. Kennedy, continued by Lyndon Johnson, anchored by Stuart Udall, the Interior Secretary of the 1960s. And I call it the long 60s environmental movement because it really went from 1960 all the way to 1974. Even Nixon becomes part of this progressive environmental movement. So right out of the gate, guys, keep in mind, there were three waves of conservation progressivism in the 20th century: FDR, Muir Pinchot, and then, TR, Muir Pinchot, and then FDR and Harold Ickes. And then the third one is JFK, Rachel Carson, Lyndon and Lady Bird, and it carries on into the Nixon years. And each of those three are deeply distinct. My book, Silent Spring Revolution, obviously giving a nod to Rachel Carson, really begins with John F. Kennedy being born in 1917 in Massachusetts, about how his mother, Rose, had spent time in Concord and was infatuated with Henry David Thoreau and Longfellow and certain writers that often wrote about natural beauty, the transcendental writers. But then how Cape Cod became kind of a sacred landscape to the Kennedy family. They loved the book by Henry David Thoreau about Cape Cod, which is still a classic. And in fact, it's Thoreau's book is promoted by Kennedy's, that started in a man named Henry Benson, Benton, who wrote the Outermost House, that led to the creation of the Cape Cod National Seashore, which John F. Kennedy established in 1961. With young JFK, there was an infatuation with the sea. It was, this stays with him his whole life. Anywhere from Hyannis down to Florida, the Atlantic seaboard, yachting culture, going to Martha's Vineyard or Nantucket, just the sea element, what some people call blue mind, where you need to be near ocean, is something that was able to help John F. Kennedy cope with the stresses in his life. But he was not in any real way a conservationist like either Roosevelt. What happened is the evolution of Jack Kennedy. And the key person in understanding that evolution is the role that William O. Douglas plays in the Kennedy family. Bill Douglas is from Yakima, Washington. He was crippled as a boy with a polio-like condition. We now know it wasn't polio, but he made his way to Columbia and went to law school, and then is hired by Joe Kennedy to run the Security Exchange Commission to bust the bad guys on Wall Street. Bill Douglas is a ardent John Muir, Theodore Roosevelt, Harold Ickes, FDR, liberal conservation environmentalist. And Bill Douglas was was adopted by Joseph Kennedy as like a son. In fact, Joe Kennedy would say about Bill, I disagree with everything he stands for in politics, just like I do with my son Jack, but they're my two favorite people in public life. And Douglas gets embedded with the Kennedy family and becomes sort of the outdoor guru. He would take Bobby Kennedy on hikes down the C&O Canal, and took Ethel and Bobby down in Washington to hike the Pacific. He took RFK all over to Siberia to go hiking together. He used to get angry at young Jack Kennedy. He'd say, Jack, your problem with you is you haven't camped enough. You haven't slept on the ground enough. Kennedy was more of a seashore person than this sort of wilderness believer that William O. Douglas was. But the Douglas role is massive after World War II. You all need to know that everybody here knows about John F. Kennedy's World War II service, the PT-109 and the Pacific and all of that. But in 1946, Jack Kennedy runs for Congress, and he wins in 46, and he wins in 48, and he wins in 50. And he wins the Senate in 52, and he wins the Senate in 58, and he wins the presidency in 60, and he dies in 1963, never having lost an election. But the person they would turn to on advice on what conservation is William O. Douglas, but also what was in the mix in Liberal Democratic Party in the 1950s. Harry Truman had zero interest in the environment. Yes, FDR really created the Everglades in 1934, but there needed to be land acquisitions And Truman in 1947 went there and gave a big speech and took credit for it. But Truman was very much about opening up all of the Western lands for ranching, livestock, jobs, the Bureau of Land Management. He wanted it mined. He was a lot more of a, had no real environmental ethic to him. Eisenhower, only modestly more than Truman, although at the end of Eisenhower's presidency, he famously in 1960 saved the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, our nation's largest in Alaska, as a trade-off when Alaska got statehood. And so he also demilitarized Antarctica and gets high marks for that, Eisenhower. But we're looking by and large, guys, from 1945 to 1960 as a dead zone period in conservation. So the baton was picked up by people like Bill Douglas sitting on the Supreme Court. And Douglas in 1960 and then in 61 wrote two influential books called My Wilderness. One was about the East, wilderness in the Eastern United States. The other, My Wilderness, these are Doubleday books, was for the West. But Douglas would go fly fishing and hiking and write about everything that he saw. And the big term, the buzzword in the 40s and 50s for environmentalists is wilderness, capital W. Because in 1935, a group founded the Wilderness Society. And it included Robert Sterling Yard, who used to be big with the National Park Service, and Aldo Leopold, who wrote Sand County Almanac, and others. Benton McKay, who's get credited for creating the Appalachian Trail. And what they wanted was that the frontier is disappearing and that you put aside massive acreage, millions of acres of land, and save it as pristine wilderness where no roads are allowed to be built. No roads, no restrooms, no concession stands, no asphalt, no mining, no oil and gas, just preserved as raw wilderness. The only way in is to hike in and out, or in some cases, perhaps canoe into the wilderness. But it was supposed to allow America to have some of that preserved for all time. It's very controversial. Young Jack Kennedy is an early backer of the Wilderness Bill. It was Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota who pushed the bill forward. William O. Douglas was the big, poobah promoting the Wilderness Act and talking wilderness. The Wilderness Society and Sierra Club got in it. But Jack Kennedy became a reliable rubber stamp for the Wilderness Act as his senator. It won't get created. In Kennedy's whole presidency, he's working hard to create this massive, today, you have 19 million acres of wilderness land. It got done in the fall of 1964, but it was really Kennedy's bill. Kennedy got it pushed through the Senate. He had Frank Church, who became a big help with him, and a Senator Clinton Anderson. But in Congress, it was getting held up by a Democrat named Wayne Aspinall, who was a Democrat from Colorado who wanted silver mining, gold mining, and didn't like all this locked up land for no economic benefit. And Kennedy would try to persuade Aspinall a lot. But eventually, it broke in right before Kennedy was killed. It became clear that in '64, the Wilderness Act would get done. So today we have all this wilderness lands in the United States, which John F. Kennedy was really one of the great progenitors of. And the other thing that happened in the 50s on this front was a showdown in Dinosaur National Monument in Utah, where Eisenhower was going to build a dam within the national monument. And the Sierra Club, led by David Brower out there at Berkeley, organized one of the most stupendous grassroots environmental campaigns of all time, and which is Leave the Dinosaur Alone. The great novelist Wallace Stegner wrote a book about leaving the dinosaur alone. Bernard DeVoto, the great columnist for Harper's, was all over not damming this river. The point, it wasn't just that the dinosaur dam would have ruined the Colorado River in a beautiful part of Utah, which it would have, but the precedent it would have meant would be that national parks and monuments could have dams built in them. And so it was all hands on deck. And earlier in one of my books, there was a famous incident in Hetch Hetchy, California, which the Great Valley there got dammed to the great anguish of John Muir. It was the Sierra Club loss. This time, the Sierra Club wins, and they are not allowed to dam in the dinosaur. And fueled by that victory, the Sierra Club really gets big. They start using photographer Ansel Adams to do posters, calendars, and books showing these beautiful black and white iconic places around the country. They're growing in membership. 1960, when Kennedy's running for president, same year Kennedy chooses Los Angeles to be where the Democratic Convention is. I mean, remember, that was Nixon's home state. And here the Democrats are making a play for California. It's no longer a Republican land out there anymore. And there's a feeling in 60 that the environmental movement, as we know it, was really percolating in California. And particularly in fighting against smog, which is another big event that happened in the Cold War days when Jack Kennedy was in Congress and the Senate. In Pennsylvania, a town called Donora, the two rivers meet and steel plants are there. And they had an inversion of hot weather that trapped all the pollutants in the valley, and the entire town of Donora, Pennsylvania had respiratory illness. Dozens of people died. Everybody else was rushed to the hospital with asthma. It's really where the word smog starts getting promoted. If you went to Donora, Pennsylvania today, you can tour the Smog Museum. There was also a killer smog in London, which killed hundreds of people in London. And then New York had a killer smog. In Los Angeles, you all remember how we used to just blanket the city. And so clean air became a big rally cry in the 1950s and early 60s. And it's John F. Kennedy who finally gets the big clean air law passed in December 63, right after he died. But throughout his legislative career, they were fighting to start putting emission standards on cars, get lead out of gasoline. And so Kennedy's part of all these things because it's politically expedient. But the one area that he's a romantic about is the seashores. And he owns the issue of national seashores. As president, John F. Kennedy, putting his shoulder to the wheel, saved Cape Cod National Seashore, Padre Island in Texas National Seashore, Point Reyes out by San Francisco, and Marin Spectacular's National Seashore, and put all these seashores in the pipeline. So beyond those big ones, San Francisco, Texas, Massachusetts, once Kennedy's killed, all of his national seashores were all lined up to be saved, and many did. Assateague in Maryland, and also lake seashores. John F. Kennedy was promoting national lake seashores because there were no national parks in the Great Lakes states. So Kennedy Johnson, but started by Kennedy, get done. Sleeping Bear National Seashore up by Traverse City, Michigan. Indiana Dunes, which is now a national park, but it was National Lakeshore outside of Chicago. Picture Rock up in Michigan. The Apostle Islands in Wisconsin. Huron, Michigan. These all are added to our National Park Service by Kennedy and Johnson, and they are spectacular sites to start saving seashore lands on the Great Lakes, and also the last bits of pristine seashore that wasn't being ruined by boardwalks, ticky-tacky commercialism, subdevelopments. Kennedy was trying to avoid the New Jerseyization of the seashores of America, because everybody wanted to buy their homes on the ocean. That their Kennedy philosophy and others around him were that we needed vast, pristine beaches that were public, that you could have beach ecosystems unmarred by technology and in the human imprint. Cape Cod, of course, splits the difference. You couldn't kick people out of Truro or Provincetown. So they built the seashore out there on Cape Cod, where you're including Cape Cod culture. where you can't build condo high rises, and everything's kind of controlled in a way to keep the indigenous charm. And I think it was a great success, Cape Cod National Seashore, and it's very similar to the Big Sur area in California, these new ways of living within nature and all of this. Also, guys, in the 50s, the big word becomes ecology. It becomes a fad, but schools start teaching ecology. And one of the groups that's born after World War II is called the Nature Conservancy. And this is still a powerhouse today. And they were looking at East Coast lands a lot, but the Nature Conservancy buys vast tracts of beautiful land, rehabilitates it, and then saves it or gives it to as a refuge and all. So it's a new way of doing things. The Nature Conservancy was saying, look, we're a capitalist society. If you want to save land, you got to buy it and sell it. And they would fundraise to save pristine parts. So you have the federal government doing things, but you also have these nonprofit groups. The Nature Conservancy really starts getting its steam rolling by the time Kennedy's president. The ecology, just so you know, the term conservation is still the word used during Kennedy's presidency. Officially, you would call it New Frontier Conservation. Stuart Udall, who I'll mention in a minute, called it third wave conservation. Others would call it preservationist conservation. But the word environment does not get used till later in the 1960s in a public policy sense. Environment, so even Lyndon Johnson calls his conservation the new conservation. But by the time of the Santa Barbara oil spill in 1969 and Earth Day being created in 1970, the term environmentalism and the environmental movement takes fold. But it's really the Kennedy years that's jumpstarting all of this, because once Kennedy gets elected, he picks Stuart Udall to be his Interior Secretary. If you go to Washington, D.C. today, you'll see that the Interior building is named after Udall, and for good reason. Only one Secretary of Interior is as noteworthy as Udall, and that is Harold Ickes, who ran Interior for FDR from 33 to 45. But their argument is made that Udall was the best. He was Mormon, grew up in rural Arizona, and played basketball at the University of Arizona, served in World War II in Europe, came back and, like Jack Kennedy, ran for Congress as a Democrat. Lyndon Johnson thought Udall was going to be a rubber stamp for him. And instead, when Jack Kennedy announced for presidency, one of the first congressmen to back Jack Kennedy was Stuart Udall. They became very close. And so Udall was in the catbird seat on the issue of loyalty, which mattered to the Kennedys. He was there from the get-go. He was from a Western state. He was deeply interested, as was Udall's wife, in Native American culture. And it used to be thought that an Interior Secretary needed to come from the Western world, where, in a state like Arizona, 3/4 of the land is owned by the federal government, or Nevada, or Idaho. Udall was a brilliant pick. And right out of the get-go, he reinvents what Interior can do. They're pushing two big things: national seashores, which Kennedy's really into, and wilderness. And Udall will hire great writers to be in Interior, people like the novelist, Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Wallace Stegner, Alan Josephy, who was American Heritage Magazine editor, who did all the books on Native Americans. He would recruit people like Ansel Adams to work photography with Interior. So the Kennedy Interior Department's a high water mark on preservation and getting America excited again about the natural beauty of our country. Kennedy will do some executive orders for national monuments, like Virgin Islands, where Lawrence Rockefeller gave a gift and Kennedy grabs the Virgin Islands to join our National Park Service, or a great cave was found in donated from Alabama. But Kennedy's big push, they're going to create new national parks. Always remember, everybody, national parks must go through Congress. You can't short circuit it with executive power. Kennedy's pushing North Cascades in Washington. He's pushing Canyonlands in Utah. He's trying to, and others. And these become all done during the Kennedy-Johnson years. You start getting an eruption, a growth, quadrupling of the units in the National Park Service under Kennedy and Johnson. Udall would end up writing a book called The Quiet Crisis, which Jack Kennedy wrote the introduction to, which is all about the new conservation, the new environmentalism, how we have to add all these new units. It's a whole America the Beautiful book. It was when Jack Kennedy would take conservation tours, he would give a speech at Gifford Pinchot's home in Milford, Pennsylvania, where the great forester of TR lived, or he would go and stay at the Rockefeller Ranch out in the Grand Tetons. He camped out in Lassen Volcano National Park in California. He went to Yosemite. The thing that makes people not see Jack Kennedy as a outdoor guy is he dressed like I am. Blazer, dark tie, blue blazer, and suddenly he's like all dressed in a suit and he's in Yellowstone. He got more interest going to the lodge and looking at, what's for dinner and things than he didn't have that excitedness about nature exploration the way FDR and TR did. But when you look at the record, it's staggering. There's no environmental legislative bill on any that Jack Kennedy turned his back on. He was if you had a conservation project, he'd want to make it happen. And but the big moment, as you all know, comes with Rachel Carson, who writes the book Silent Spring in 1962. Rachel Carson is born a decade earlier. She's born in 1907. She's a decade older than Jack Kennedy, born in Springdale, Pennsylvania. Went to the women's college in Pennsylvania, wanted to become a biologist, went and studied at Johns Hopkins zoology, went to Woods Hole, which is just down the road from Hyannis, which is the Mecca Center if you want to do oceanographic studies, really in the world still in many ways. But and she started working for Fish and Wildlife under FDR. She started writing booklets and doing radio broadcasts, Rachel Carson, in the 40s and 50s about our national wildlife refuges. And then she started writing a trilogy of books, the first called the Sea Wind, but her Sea trilogy were loved by the Kennedy family. They are all about studying of oceans, written in a dramatic and beautiful flair. She became a National Book Award winner on her books on the oceans, published in the Atlantic, and she became a superstar because she can combine exact science with gorgeous prose. And her Sea trilogies are just monuments in American history. I mean, they're just gorgeous. Nobody's surpassed her in writing about the ocean. Well, she joined the New Frontier in 1960. She campaigned for Jack Kennedy. She became early on the head of the environment plank conservation for Jack Kennedy, for a group called the Democratic Advisory Council. They would advise, so Dean Acheson would advise Jack Kennedy on foreign affairs, or John Kenneth Galbraith would informally advise Kennedy on the economy. Rachel Carson would advise the Kennedy campaign on conservation environmental issues. She met with Jackie Kennedy, and she was with the Women for John F. Kennedy. So it was a big deal when he was elected. It changed her life. She was proud to be part of the Kennedy energy of that era. She would later start going out to Hickory Hill quite a bit to be with Bobby, and all of Kennedy's kids, including Bobby Jr., remembers what a big deal it was, Rachel Carson coming into their Kennedy orbit. But starting in the late 50s, she was on William O. Douglas and Marjorie Spock, the sister of Benjamin Spock, the famous baby doctor, and others were really looking at DDT. From 1940, DDT in World War II, Jack Kennedy could get sprayed in DDT to kill mosquitoes for malaria. But by 45, at Pawtuxet National Wildlife Center near DC in Maryland, they did experiments in seeing if you sprayed DDT on fish, the fish would all die, and it was going to affect the wildlife. And there became a look, well, this is just going to it's made the eggs of eagle shells shrink, and the chemical compounds of DDT, Rachel Carson thought were a killer of the natural environment. And she started writing in the late 50s the book Silent Spring while she was going through chemotherapy for breast cancer. She was go to Cleveland Clinic and Mayo and all of this, trying to get help with her cancer while she was working on Silent Spring. And she finally finished the book in 62. And she got invited to John F. Kennedy's famous White House conservation meeting with all the big ones. And William O. Douglas started spreading the word that we're going to get behind Rachel Carson's book, which attacks the pesticide and chemical companies of America. And famously, the New Yorker started serializing it, and the whole country was talking about it. Why it was a revolution is Rachel Carson wasn't saying, well, oh, isn't Cape Cod beautiful? We should save it. Or gosh, look at those redwood groves, let's save it. She was telling mothers and fathers, your children are getting sick playing in their backyard due to these insecticides and things that are being sprayed. Meaning public health. Your family is getting sick. And at this famous press conference, John F. Kennedy finally evoked Ms. Carson, who wasn't married, but she was taking care of a child that she had adopted due to a death. But the book came out, and it was called the Uncle Tom's Cabin, game-changing book about what we are doing with putting chemicals into our lives. It coincided with SANE, which are people fighting against nuclear testing. And it's not a coincidence that John F. Kennedy's the president who signs the nuclear test ban treaty, banning atmospheric testing by Russia and Britain and the United States, because the fear was of all of the downfall from all of that, it was making everybody sick. And so they're combined together, anti-nukes, public health, movement of organic gardening is better than chemical foods and pesticides. Formaldehyde, which making babies deform, gets banned, all in this condensed Kennedy period going on here. And Jack Kennedy, of course, gets killed in 63, end of the year, November. And Rachel Carson dies in 64 of cancer. And it's in the wake of the two of them that this revolution with their deaths gets carried onwards by Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird, Bill Douglas, and Rachel Carson's followers. And it grows and it grows and it grows. And it leads to things like the birth of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, Endangered Species in 1973, more Clean Air and Water Acts, the NEPA environmental policy acts by Nixon, which makes you have to have an environmental impact statement if you're going to build anything. We're living today on all of those laws that came out of the Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon years. The heroes of the Nixon years with all of this are William Ruckelshaus, more known for his dissent during Watergate, but Ruckelshaus was a conservative conservationist and convinced Nixon to go forward with EPA. And also John Ehrlichman was an environmentalist. I know he's always lumped together Haldeman and Ehrlichman, Nixon's henchmen, but he was a lawyer up in Seattle, and Ehrlichman convinced Nixon that everybody wanted environmental things. It became the wave, and being pragmatic, Nixon tacked to the left as far as he felt like it on environmental issues, to kind of co-opt Ed Muskie and others and Scoop Jackson promoting that issue. The net effect is, guys, it was an amazing revolution. We all now have gave birth to environmental law. William O. Douglas would argue in the Supreme Court that rocks and trees have standing. Douglas would argue that if a hurricane hits Port Aransas, Texas on the Gulf, where there's a wildlife refuge, and if I bought a house at Port Aransas to go bird watching, to watch sandhill cranes migrate, and so I bought a bird watcher's house, if there's an oil spill that ruined my house, that the oil company has to pay it because they damaged the house because they took away the return of the migratory birds. Very far out there stuff, Douglas. We're still not out there environmental law to the way that but Douglas almost single-handedly created the whole issue. And then these guys are pushing for wild and scenic rivers, all of them, rivers that aren't dammed, big showdowns in places like that Kennedy wanted, the Current River in the Ozarks, the Buffalo River in Little Rock, in Arkansas. There are all these rivers that we have in our country that are designated wild and scenic, damless stretches that also work with the national park system. So it's a remarkable success story. Lady Bird Johnson adopts Stuart Udall, and they're able to get done national parks like Redwoods National Park in California and Guadalupe in Texas, and the North Cascades gets done, and numerous others. She becomes known for beautification, no billboards on highways, scenic roads, that we kind of an America Beautiful movement that kicks hold, and she's one of the great environmental heroes of that period too. And at the same time, and I'll end with this, there's another movement going on in the US, which is called environmental justice, which is starting to look at why are we dumping toxic waste where poor people live, and particularly people of color, African-American communities, Latino communities, Native American reservations, that people would take toxic waste and just dump them in neighborhoods where poor people live, creating all sorts of health issues. And that's born in this Kennedy period. The Kennedy family, of course, embraces Cesar Chavez, who's fighting against pesticides being sprayed in California, and working with United Farm Workers. And Bobby Kennedy famously broke his fast with Cesar Chavez. And Martin Luther King was killed in Memphis with the garbage workers strike. And these are all get tied together because now there became, in this new environmental awakening, to look at the disparity that, rich people can go move and get a beautiful home up by Yellowstone and have a pristine water in their backyard. But if you're poor in Cleveland, the Cuyahoga River catches on fire in your backyard and your children get sick. So there's a look at all of the social issues and all that are coming part in this silent spring revolution that I'm writing back. So I'm grappling with the wilderness movement, expansion of parks, pristine beaches and lakes, but also, the poor person's movement to try to have better environmental standards in urban areas, what Barack Obama calls urban wilderness, ways that you can have outdoor recreation in an urban setting where you have clean rivers and clean lakes. Why can't kids go swimming in rivers in urban areas? And why can't we have more park units near population centers, not just out in far-flung middle of Nevada? And so it is a really ripe time. It died, the Silent Spring Revolution, because William O. Douglas leaves the Supreme Court, and a man, Justice Lewis Powell, comes in, and Powell created, with the Chamber of Commerce, a plan to blow back these environmental laws. And they created the Cato Institute, the American Enterprise Institute. They've created Heritage Foundation, they started saying, trying to destroy the environmental gains of the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon years. And that's what we're seeing going on with the Trump administration now. They're trying to roll all of this back to a pre-New Frontier era, because the environmental movement caught big business by such surprise. They got regulated so much, suddenly chemical factories and oil factories and refineries, and you could sue public health. It caught that corporate world by surprise. And they created a counter movement, which is really pretty much held firm. And you see Trump exacerbating it more and more now. We've had moments when Barack Obama was a very good environmental president with, and so was Jimmy Carter. But the other team, call it anti-environmental movement, really grew in money, power, and organization. And it's been just, it's a loggerheads with each other. And of course, the Kennedy Johnson side believes today in climate change. And of course, you're dealing with the other side that's climate denying. So the battle continues, but make no mistake about it. The wins in the 60s and early 70s were massive and regular. And it was a heyday in American history of conservation victories.
Thank you, Doug. I let people start asking questions. As you've spoken, I remember you speaking about American Moonshot and saying President Kennedy knew how to make heroes. And what I hear as you're talking about the story of conservation is that Udall particularly knew how to tell the beauty, recruit the stories about American beauty and the landscape, which is so central to our American ethos and that frontier spirit, just as the moonshot is. And it really seems that Rachel Carson combined that beauty and science together. Where was Kennedy on understanding ecology or the science behind things? I know that he had a love of place, and what seem to be the levers are both the preservation and the public health notice that pops up. But how did Kennedy evolve on public health and his own approach to preservation and conservation?
He was very big on public health because he was so racked with illness himself, a little like FDR. And the reports were coming in. I mean, the science was undeniable that we knew the downwind from atomic testing was poisonous. Kennedy would say his greatest accomplishment was that nuclear test ban treaty to stop people from being sick from testing atmospheric. He not only did he embrace Rachel Carson, but they put his science advisory team went and looked in it, and they said she's not a fraud, she's right, and they backed her action. And when you have the president of the United States backing your action, that's a very powerful thing, meaning that we've got to start getting rid of some of these chemicals out of our life. And you start getting, asbestos banned and, certain aerosols and on and on and on, smoking on the warning packs, and all of this regulatory society starts getting born post Silent Spring. Kennedy, as a person, was really a Marine infused, as I said. I mean, he chose those seashores as what he wanted his conservation legacy to be. He did the wilderness acts, which are, but the big one was he wanted Olive to be the guy who saved it. He had read a booklet in 1955 on vanishing seashores, and he kind of bought into all of that. He thought it was good up in Massachusetts, and he put his political muscle into it. And he got great kudos for Cape Cod, and he kept building on it. And, Lyndon Johnson was opposed to the Padre Island National Seashore in Texas because it blocks off one of the most, look on a map how big it is. It's for turtle nesting and, just open swept beach. And even Johnson wanted it developed. But Kennedy kept pushing to save these last bits of shoreline so we could see what the real ocean looked like without development.
I remember you said that in writing American Moonshot that it was the political will he built by investing in that innovation quarter. Say more about how Kennedy created the political collaboration and buy-in from Congress to get move this agenda forward.
I know this is a Kennedy savvy group listening in here, but I hope you all realize that John F. Kennedy was not only push space, but push oceanographic exploration. When he was talking about science and exploration, he also wanted to go to the bottom of the ocean and the sea. Just a few weeks ago, Kathy Sullivan became our nation's first woman spacewalker, is now gone to the deepest part of the ocean of any human being. With all that's going on with COVID-19 and Trump and all this, it doesn't make the national news that you would think. So Kennedy saw ocean exploration as a huge thing. And part of it was in the mix. I mean, Jacques Cousteau's TV shows were popular, and Walt Disney was doing things about seals and dolphins and the oceans. And so Kennedy promoting science of both, you know, the new frontier in science of both, you know, to go to the stars and the moon and Mars, but also to explore our oceans. And Kennedy constantly pushed to use salt water to get fresh water for saline. Get rid of the salt so you had fresh water, that you could develop a freshwater drinking system. He thought was going to be a large thing that would help drought all over the world, help poor people all over the world by having a permanent fresh water supply by desalinization processes. Yes, it might come to fruition someday. You can do it. They're doing it in places in California right now, but it's very expensive. It's proven to be very cost inhibitive, but someday I would not be surprised that we're coastal areas will be drinking fresh water from the sea. And Congress, look, he had allies. The conservation crowd, the big ones, the name ones that work with Kennedy and Johnson are Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, who's the founder of Earth Day. Nelson convinced Jack Kennedy to fly up to the Apostle Islands and to fight to make it a lakeshore. That's way up in northern Wisconsin, and he got Kennedy to go up there. Frank Church of Idaho, who was really close to Jack Kennedy. Clinton Anderson of New Mexico. Paul Douglas, the senator from Illinois. Scoop Jackson of Washington, and Ed Muskie of Maine. Those were the lions on environment and conservation, and they'd each have different areas that they would, promote, but they were powerful, and it was a real lobby. And then you had Republicans that were willing to work with them. In Congress, one of the greatest environmentalist politicians of all time was a Republican from Pennsylvania, John Saylor's his name, Saylor. Also John Dingell up there in Michigan was promoting it a lot too. And you can get crossover votes on senators you wouldn't expect, like Barry Goldwater was opposed to the damming of the Colorado and Arizona. And there still were Republicans to make things bipartisan on conservation. You won't have that today. It's become completely and utterly polarized.
You also describe, and this is clear, Kennedy's personality could be a power coach. Like having his moonshot speech at Rice University is the perfect setting for that speech, and he really plays to win, super competitive. And then you see his role being really about blocking, protecting the integrity, the truth of what Rachel Carson is offering, and that scientific advisory committee comes out. Can you say a little bit, and you also describe him as public enemy number one in that August, I think 62, when he says he's read Carson's book and is putting together a committee on this. Talk a little bit about what the political backlash on him is and how he dealt with that, or how they dealt with that as a
Well,
team.
there was enormous backlash because Kennedy's warring against corporate culture. He's taking on oil, gas, and particularly all the petrochemical companies of America. He's basically arguing that we need an environmental protection agency, that these companies aren't regulated and they're killing our lakes and our waters, their unregulated sewage. And so we're going to have to put all of these standards. And that's why the overreaction to Silent Spring, it wasn't just the book, but if this got to, the big corporate people realized this was going to cost them a lot of money if they had to start either doing away with product lines, have the federal government tell them what they could and couldn't do. It's hard for us to remember a pre-EPA world, but things were done pretty willy-nilly. And companies could just dump in whatever they wanted into these industrial rivers, and there was no consequence. And Kennedy's starting to make it a consequence. So he knows he's writing off those constituents, but he's picking up constituents, what I guess today they're talking about suburban women. Women's clubs of America were very much behind beautification and Silent Spring and healthy babies, and he appealed to women's organizations and women's groups a lot. The Sierra Club now was on fire recruiting people. I mean, they just were burning it up, getting people involved in grassroots activism to save places. They hit all the old time conservation groups. So a coalition was built by John F. Kennedy and Udall, which they felt gave them a stronger hand. And who wants to be for the dirty water people? Who wants to be for the toxic chemical folk? Yes, it polarized the country some, but they had enough to make this happen. And it just grew and grew and grew. By the time you have Dr. Seuss doing the Lorax, and you know, you have Marvin Gaye singing songs like "Mercy, Mercy Me," you know, about the environment, and Joni Mitchell doing songs about you know, saving the coyotes in the canyons, and then we had all these poets, Beat Generation poets like Allen Ginsberg and the like, that were doing environmental poetry, and we had green movement people, organic, back to the land groups. So they liked Kennedy enough, so he really had a kind of a coalition going, and the cost of that was angering these certain companies.
So there's a question that I think we can combine from.
I might say this. Remember,
sure.
Kennedy, on the other hand, was loved by the aerospace community. McDonnell Douglas and going to the moon and all that money, 4.4% of our national budget, that he got embraced by the military industrial complex on those, meaning, you know, North American Aviation, or, you know, all these big aerospace groups loved Jack Kennedy. So he didn't rupture that part of Fortune 500 world. It was only this petrochemical oil gas crowd that, you know, so he was careful to make sure. And in those Cold War days, he had the big guns, the people that were building the planes, the military to win the Cold War on his side. It was just, and in case of DDT, you know, it didn't get banned until 1972. So even though Rachel Carson's book came out in 62, I mean, it took a decade for it to go through the courts and all to actually ban the product. So nothing was instantaneous, but Carson and Kennedy opened up the consciousness of the nation that what we did during World War II was just pour all these chemicals into our atmospheres, waters, new products. Even today, you can barely go to a grocery store and not see all these chemicals on a label, you know, and that was all going on. And so this was a warning. What is this? What chemicals? Who's saying this is safe? Who's testing these? How do we know? And they use things like the whales and the bald eagle to become the charismatic symbols of that movement. The sperm whale and the stories of whales and dolphins being tangled and tuna nets and the eagle almost going to extinct due to DDT and things started opening up the public consciousness. And then Walter Cronkite was a huge environmentalist, and he's on CBS News doing environmental stories all the time. And so it really kind of clicked.
You really show, and I think about Cronkite and the trust that he established. But there is a question from the audience that with the Roosevelts and the Kennedys choosing environmental focus, certainly they had a personal interest in this, but what was it about the presidency and their role for advancing these things that may not be at the top of an agenda compared to economics or what was going on with the war or those types of things?
Well, there used to be Brahmins and ruling elite in the United States, and there was always a feeling of custodianship. This sense of that you judge a farmer by how his land looks. It was the sloppy people that clear cut and didn't replant trees. There was a conservation ethos, and it was very, the Yale School of Forestry and Harvard's forest and all the Ivy League schools were quite advanced on promoting conservation and in ecology and environmentalism. So it was a harder working class issue. It sounded like something for dilettantes, aristocrats, hunting clubs. But that got broken down by Rachel Carson because she's starting to tell working people they're dumping crap in your backyard and your kid's getting sick. And she started telling middle class people, is your lake dirtier than it used to be? Can you even, if you swim in it, can you get sick? And the answer all over the country was yes, 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 we could get sick. And so that's where the revolution comes in. So for the Kennedy family, being pro-conservation was quite natural. I mean, the Rockefellers had saved Arcadia National Park in Maine, and Kennedys are looking to save Cape Cod National Seashore. And, it wasn't that far afoot from their upbringing. Bobby Kennedy loves the outdoor world, and Bobby Kennedy Jr., as you know, loves it even more. They became tutored under William O. Douglas and a real believer in also the outdoor life, the strenuous life, that hiking and kayaking and fresh air and camping and sailing, and that these were good for the soul. And Jack Kennedy even put a challenge while he was president to see if people can march like 40 miles a day in the outdoor, take long hikes and things like this. So there was a little bit of machoism to some of that with Kennedy, the old, real men hike and all this. And there's also a sort of aristocratic demeanor to some of it. But there was also a cutting edge understanding that science was the new God. In 1960, scientists were Time Magazine's People of the Year.
So,
and he's running for president, that these scientists were becoming listened to.
Yeah. So
the ecologists, like, very commoner in people.
I have, we're about out of time, and I have two questions. One is about the history, and one is about thinking about practical moonshots or Earthshots or things today. But and that macho wilderness history, what you're sharing here is the story of Rachel Carson changing the game in a big way. And how it also seems that this is really a team effort and not just one person championing it along the way. So it seems really related to the times we're in. Why do you think, when we know all the science, when we know all the dangers of what's going to happen with any number of environmental issues or climate change, what will it take to get more of the traction to push that forward again? Because it seems like a very similar time here as the 60s.
I think that the Kennedy, let's call it Kennedy Johnson long 60s, we forget that that was a great progressive run, and how much went down on civil rights and environment and housing, and one would have thought it'd go on forever. But you need to believe me that the opposition to that grew, and they knew they wouldn't be able to do it overnight. They started training, setting up university programs. They created a counter statement to it, and it's really taken hold. And it started in earnest with the Reagan years, but it's just grown and grown and grown. So you're now having a half the country that see, you call somebody an environmentalist, you might as well call them a communist. Meaning we're in a war, cultural war. Environmentalists are on one side and the other side isn't. That other side is oil, gas, extraction industries have organized with Chamber of Commerce's and saying we want unfettered capitalism, that the deep state is trying to take our profits away, that the deep states loves every tree they see and they want to marry an animal. And it's strong. So the offense is not with the environmental world, the climate change people now, they're on the defense. For a while in the Obama year, it looked like with the Paris Accord and maybe China would come along and things, that there may be a new environmental movement underfoot, a climate movement. But alas, the big legacy of the Obama 8 years with Sally Jewell and Ken Salazar at Interior was opening up the net of history. Obama used executive orders to stay Stonewall LGBTQ site as a national monument in New York. He saved Cesar Chavez's home and burial site, national monument in California, Buffalo Soldiers, African-American homes that were saved, Bears Ears in Utah to be jointly administered by African Americans. Obama used that Interior to open up the multicultural narrative. And now you see that getting closed down by attempts by the right, and we're in that cultural war now. So the climate change issue, which is so hard to deal with, it's going to take bipartisan effort, or else one side, the Democrats, would have to really own the Senate and Congress the way Lyndon Johnson did and go to town. But it'd be a big mistake to underestimate, if you're an environmentalist, the opposition to all this that Kennedy and Johnson and even Nixon did, that they want to wipe out their legacies.
So my last question is, we're in a crisis, a public health crisis, and there's a lot of push for the economic return. What are the kind of takeaways from the Kennedy administration for practical best steps for moving an agenda like this forward?
You have to listen to the scientists, and that's what Jack Kennedy did. To him, scientists were the knights of the round table. Whether it was oceans or wilderness, whether it was space exploration, or we needed. We are living in this scientific revolution, the scientific age, and we now have a problem where people don't care what the scientists say, or at least a lot of people don't. And so that puts us in where there's no referees anymore. There is no Walter Cronkite calling balls and strikes. You're with Fox or you're with MSNBC, or there is no scientists are, well, my scientist says this, your scientist says that. Your idea of what's of a wilderness area is different than my idea of a wilderness. We don't really have anybody refereeing the game. And so it's created intense lobbying and money on both sides, who can raise the most to smash each other's message. And meanwhile, the planet is heading into a form of extinction. Species are perishing. We're seeing how fragile we are to coronavirus and possible future pandemics. And we really got to pull our acts together here. I would say, as much as nobody is more excited about we went to the moon than my Moonshot book. And I want to go back to the moon and Mars, but we really need an Earthshot right now. We've got to focus on how to pull the Earth together and get control over the narrative of the hyper-industrialization and the burning planet, the curse of continued fossil fuels. I mean, we're now in a crisis mode, and one would think that a leader like Jack Kennedy or Theodore Roosevelt or FDR would have been dealing with it in a way, thinking what's the long-term best for people, not what's best for me today.
Well, this has just been so great to speak with you this week, Doug, particularly with Wednesday being the 60th anniversary of the New Frontier speech. Yeah. And Candidate Kennedy, of course, said, we face not a set of promises, but a set of challenges. Courage, not complacency, is our need today. Leadership, not salesmanship. There's so much to draw from history. Is there any other, maybe it's even just personal for you as you think about the next 6 months or the election coming up or the work that needs to be happening around environmental justice and environmental work in the future? Is there one takeaway you'd want people to kind of think of?
Well, that we need a new frontier. We need one that we're putting the scientists at the top of our agenda, where a government where experts matter and aren't derided and aren't run out of town, aren't treated as castaways. We're really going to have to lean on our science elites to kind of help get us out of the messes that we're in right now, which are really quite serious. The good news is our research and development's good in the US. Our universities can be strong. But people are depleted and exhausted right now. And so they need to feel hopeful. And Jack Kennedy was always optimistic, always knew how to make people feel that our better days were coming. So some kind of morale boost to the sagging spirits of a country, because many people are feeling we are no longer the nation that we once were. And that the real message is we can become that we can reclaim a lot of this if we just take a little bit of the JFK spirit along and register to vote, be civically engaged, realize it matters, and no matter what, be there on election day. Because without a lot of voter participation, you do see how a democracy can wilt away.
Whether it's Douglas or Carson or Udall, you've really reminded us that it is about collaborative leadership together and everyone bringing the best of their talents to a team or a mission. And certainly Kennedy was good at drawing people together. And I think speaking with historians like you, it reminds us that now is our time to do that as well. And it's Absolutely. A crisis that activates us to think about higher levels of leadership. So I really thank you so much, Doug.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for all listening who's ever out there. Appreciate y'all.